get started. Before I hand things over to Dr. Fair, we have a little introduction from our partners at the North Carolina Forest Service. We have Andy Pleninger, who is the program head for the Urban and Community Forestry program within the Forest Service. I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to you, Andy, and you can give everybody just a little bit of background on this NC Trees and Storms effort.
Well, thank you, Leslie. Yeah, a little introduction. I know I can assume pretty safely that all you folks are lovers of trees, and I thought I would start by showing some North Carolina statistics, and here we go. Does that look like right, Leslie?
Yes, we see you loud and clear.
Okay. So yes. So here's a little breakdown of North Carolina. 3.9 million acres. Excuse me. Bear with me a second. 3.9 million acres of urban lands. And you know, we're growing. I think we all know that, 2% since 2010. On the really positive side, we have 320 million urban trees, and our urban canopy covering our urban areas is 54%, which too is a blessing. National average is about 43%. So we have an awesome asset here. North Carolina's urban trees sequester. Of course, my slide doesn't work. Here we go. There we go. They sequester 2.1 million tons of carbon a year and 50,000 tons of air pollutants a year. Our trees are little stormwater management machines. In Raleigh, a study revealed that residential trees reduce storm runoff by 19 to 24%. You know, shading and wind protection by our trees reduce our energy use by $150 million a year, and avoided power emissions equal $86 million a year. And on the economic side, may raise our property values upwards of 15%. And you know, when shoppers, when trees are present, they spend between 9 and 12% more on products. So, you know, awesome benefits that our trees are providing, all the way down to the trees in your own yard. That said, we are losing canopy cover across the state every year, 4,500 acres. Now, the majority of that is not, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, is not the result of storm damage. That's a contributor. Stop. All right. And so here, you know, today's program, you know, we're going to try and do what we can on storm side. So this is, as Leslie mentioned, a series, Trees and Storms, 3 R's, Readiness, Response, Recovery, educational programs for folks like you and to communities to reduce the impacts of these storm events if we can. And I'd just like to take this time to thank our partners, the council, Leslie, NC State Extension, Barb, also our federal representatives and the U.S. Forest Service. They are partially funding this project. So if you run into one of them, take the opportunity to thank them yourselves if it arises. And so thank you for joining us, your interest in conserving trees. And I encourage you to become engaged in urban community forestry efforts in your own community if you can. So with that, I will pass it off back to Leslie and let Barb share her great knowledge. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andy. Barb, I've made it so that you can share your screen. There we are, it's coming up just fine. So now we're gonna get started with the main affair of tonight's webinar. We've got Dr. Barbara Fair. She is a landscape extension specialist at NC State University, and she's been a longtime partner of the Urban Forest Council and a lifetime ex officio member of our board. She helps us out a lot with a lot of our education and outreach efforts for proper tree care and tree management. And tonight she is going to talk about getting your trees ready for the coming storm season. So with that, Barb, I'll let you go ahead and get started. Did you want me to run the polls now or in just a little bit?
Yeah, why don't you run them now?
Okay. All right, so just to get a little bit of background from those of you on the call tonight, this will kind of work our way into the topic at hand. We have a couple of little polling questions that you should see pop up on your screen. So if you just take a minute or two or a few seconds and let us know if you do currently inspect the trees on your property around your house regularly, and that regularly can be every year, every couple years. Do you do it yourself? Do you hire a professional, whether they're a certified arborist or not? This will kind of give us an idea of where everybody's coming from perspective-wise on the call tonight. So I'll just give everybody just a few more seconds to put in, you know, if they look at their trees on a regular basis or not, and hopefully this will be a learning opportunity for everybody. All right, looks like we've got most of the folks responding. So I will close it and share it so everybody can see. It looks like majority of folks say yes, they at least take a look at their trees on a regular basis, just themselves, with about 15% saying no, they don't look at their trees regularly, and about 15% say they actually hire a certified arborist to come look at their tree, which is great. That's a great response. So, okay, and the next question, we'll move to the second one real quick. So just so we know where everybody's coming from on this one, have you experienced storm damage on your property in the past? So have you had an entire tree fall over due to a storm or wind event? Have you lost large limbs, or you have not experienced storm damage, but you're here to learn more and you're concerned about it? So just give everybody a few seconds to put in their answers for this one, just so we can see what everybody's experience level is and where we're coming from. All right, I think we've got most of the folks responding right now. So I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then I'll share the responses back with everybody. All right, so it looks like a majority of the folks on the call today has had some form of experience with storm damage in the past to the trees. They've either lost the entire tree itself falling over with 43% or lost large limbs. So hopefully we'll be addressing some of these concerns so you'll know what to look for. And then the last question we've got before we get started is, have you ever had any of the trees, younger trees, smaller trees, pruned, or had young tree pruning or young tree training performed on any of your trees? And this is just for us to get an idea of what your knowledge level is on this. And so that's, and Dr. Fair is going to be talking about this a little bit during her presentation. So if you're not sure, you're not sure, and you're going to learn something tonight, which is great. So I'll just give everybody a few seconds to put in their response here. I'm getting a surprising response back, which is I'm glad to see on here. I think we've got everybody's responses in now, so I'll close and share this. So it looks like we actually have more than half of you that have had some proper, young tree training or young tree pruning performed on their trees, which is great to see. And then others that either aren't sure or you haven't done this. And this is something that Dr. Fair is going to talk about in a little detail tonight. So, all right, great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your response. And then, all right, with that, Barb, you're ready to go.
Okay, thank you very much, both Leslie and Andy. That was a great introduction to what trees do for us, and I'm sure many of you recognize that. Maybe you didn't know how amazing trees are and what they can actually do, particularly with stormwater and so forth. And so that kind of fits, of course, into this whole topic tonight, right, about storms and what we're going to face. And so tonight I'm going to talk to you about a few different things. I'm going to talk a little bit about how amazing I think trees are, of course, and how adapted they are to certain environments. What's going on with storms in North Carolina, give you a little bit of idea of some predictors. Not too much in depth there, just a glance at what we can expect, and certainly what you've probably already been seeing out there. How do we get our trees kind of ready for that storm, right? And then we'll wrap it up with a few kind of readiness tips. And the cool thing is what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, we are also preparing a brochure for. So there'll be 2 brochures that'll be coming out in the next maybe 6 months or so at the latest. One is about readiness, and the second one will be about response and recovery, which is what our second webinar will be later in the month of June. So this is a bristlecone pine out in the western part of the United States. What a cool tree this is, right? This is a tree that is adapted to actually let a huge portion of itself die back, so another portion of the tree can actually continue to live on. And these organisms out here are all really closely related, if not exact clones of one another, living out in this area. So an amazing tree, and guess how long this tree can actually live? There are 2 really old ones recorded out there. Both of them are over 5,000 years old. So how amazing is that? We cannot expect that in our urban environments, of course, but just to know that trees can live that long and have adapted to these really harsh climates. Now, we can have trees live a few hundred years, and this is the angel oak in South Carolina. If you've ever had a chance to see it, you know how just magnificent this plant is. Of course, we have to adapt and have things holding up the limbs, but this tree is between 400 and 500 years old. I used to live in Minnesota many years ago, and I did get to see this tree. It's called the witch tree. It is on the Chippewa Grand Portage Reservation in Minnesota, right on the tip of the arrowhead. And this tree is about 300 years old. Look at where it's growing. It's not really growing in soil, right? It's kind of growing in rock, and how long it's lived there is just in a really harsh climate. It's pretty cool. Of course, Joshua tree, these aren't exactly trees, right? But again, well adapted to their climate. Baobab trees in Africa, just keep in mind how resilient trees are. And you'll hear me use that word a lot tonight, this idea of resilient trees. But again, a storm comes in, what can we do to help mitigate potential damage? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight primarily. So in North Carolina, of course, we know that we had a drought this spring, right? And we can expect more of those over time. We can also expect that there's going to be greater precipitation as well at different times of the year. And so what we're seeing is with climate change, we're seeing that the sea temperatures are increasing, and this has implications for the land. They indicate that you might see an increase between 2 and 11% on average of an increased wind speed, 20% increase in precipitation rates. And that's really important to keep in mind because it does have immediate impacts on trees, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so, of course, you may also have more storms per year, and they may be more extreme, right? So remember, weather is local, climate is global. And one of the things I'm going to talk about are these ideas, this convective storm. What exactly is a convective storm, right? So we think about hurricanes, but a convective storm is actually much more common for what we have in the Southeast. And what happens is, and I'm not a meteorologist, I'm a tree person. So what I understand is with the convective storm, you have the warm air rises up, and then there are other, of course, atmospheric conditions happening, humidity, pressure, and all of those things. And they affect what can happen to that storm. So it could develop into a tornado. It could develop into a thunder and lightning storm. It can cause hail. And then certainly it can cause what we call these straight line winds. And some of you may have heard of microbursts. Well, a microburst is really kind of a special occurrence, and it's actually fairly common here in the Southeast in the summer months. And what happens in a microburst, it's a very localized column of air that kind of sinks down. So it's what they would call a downdraft, and it happens during a thunderstorm. The thing is that these winds can be upwards of 100 or more miles per hour, which is very similar to a tornadic winds. So certainly you can imagine the amount of damage that can be caused. And I'm actually going to show you a tree that was damaged due to one of the microbursts that we had around NC State's campus a couple of years ago. So we can expect, though, that when we have these storms and we have significant flooding that comes along with those. And remember, flooding happens everywhere, but flooding is certainly exaggerated in our developed urban areas because we have all of this impervious surface and we have nowhere for the water to go. And so this is just a great example of what happens when, keep in mind that flood water is super powerful, and precipitation can actually cause these really wet soils. And so, of course, the longer a storm hovers and hangs around in an area, obviously the more precipitation you're going to have. But keep in mind, the roots of a tree are held in there by the pressure and friction between the roots and the soil. Okay, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? How do they relate to one another? And so they're kind of holding each other up, so to speak. And when you have that really wet soil, it kind of begins to collapse. And there's less friction between the roots and the soil, and the tree can lose stability because of that. So you can imagine really wet soils and trees fail. And when I use the word fail, that means a tree typically falls over, or a branch failing means that that branch has broken off of the tree. So the other thing that's left, and I could go into many details about flooding, but we're not going to talk about that tonight, but when you have a storm that's come through and you've had flooding for a number of days, you can have factors that affect that root collar. So when I say that, you can see my arrow here. This is what we call the root collar or root plate of the tree, sometimes referred to as the buttress roots, which are those roots that, you know, hold up the tree. Those are those big, strong, large size roots that help hold that tree up and allow it to blow in the wind. So when you see a tree, right, we want it to have this taper at the base, because that's what gives the tree strength in heavy winds, right? It allows it to move back and forth with the wind. Of course, there are some times when winds are just so powerful that a tree can't stand up, or there's other issues. And flooding for an extended period of time can cause decay and death of those roots. And so you may not always know it's happened if there's no outward sign of that. So we're going to go through some steps of what you can do to prepare your landscape for a storm. And again, this can be any kind of storm, really, and understanding that there are some things that we just can't fix, right? We can't control thunderstorms and hurricanes, and not every tree, no matter how healthy it is, cannot necessarily withstand a tornado or a certain hurricane, or even a really severe thunderstorm. So one of the things, though, is you can select wind-resistant species. There are certainly species out there that you can plant that are much more wind-resistant than other species. And in the brochure, we have a couple of tables that we're going to show to you about those that are really highly wind-resistant, those are maybe more moderate, and those are a little bit less wind-resistant. And the catch is, of course, we know that we're not just picking plants for our landscape for one function, right? So we have to think about what's the whole purpose. Why are we putting that tree in our landscape? For shade, for stormwater retention, for, you know, all of the beauty that trees provide. And so we have to think about it on a more holistic level and think about what are all the factors that we have to consider when we're deciding whether or not to put a particular species in. This is a Kentucky coffee tree. It is a native tree. I haven't seen it used as much as I would like to here in the Southeast. It does prefer a little bit higher pH, closer to 7, but I've seen it do quite well at 6 and 6.5. And it has this amazing structure that it looks kind of like an ugly duckling tree when it's young, but as it gets more mature, it becomes pretty cool, and it's almost like the Halloween spooky tree when it gets larger. And so the way those branches are structured make it much more resistant to wind. And I should tell you, a lot of where these species lists have come from is from observations from many city arborists across the United States, actually, and mostly on the eastern half of the United States, including Florida, all the way up to New York, where they've looked at those trees that have survived after a storm, and those trees that maybe they need only a little bit of pruning to fix them after a storm. Maybe they just lose branches. So a wind-resistant tree is one that's considered tough enough that it won't blow over, but it might lose a few branches along the way. And we can help minimize how many branches are lost by good pruning, of course. And Leslie mentioned that when she asked you about training young trees. And I love the fact that so many of you are doing that. That is incredibly important. That's my soapbox that I teach a lot about when I talk about pruning. So 2 trees, live oak, you might think of live oak as more of a southern species or only a coastal species. We're seeing that you're going to be able to push that envelope a little bit, and I'm seeing very successful live oak grown here in the Raleigh area. Now, could you get it to the mountains? Probably not, but maybe a little bit more in the Piedmont. And of course, as we get warmer temperatures, you may be able to use this more frequently. Swamp, and of course, it's a native. Swamp white oak is another native. And you might think that because it says swamp in its title, that it might only like wet sites, but it does actually do pretty well in drier locations as well. So bald cypress, great tree, tough urban tree. We use it in a lot of places. We use it in stormwater management, BMPs. We use it as street trees. Just a really all around really tough tree. Now Sabal palm, I threw that in there because of course if you're from the coast, you'll see a lot more palms, and Sabal palm happens to be a native. It's a fairly short one, but keep in mind palms are not trees, right? We call them palm trees, but they're not exactly trees. They are more closely related to grasses. And so when you think about when you go to the beach, right, or you see those weather people out there, right, weathering the big storm, you know, and they've got their jackets on and their hoods up and they're out there filming everything that happens, you see those palm trees bending way over, almost touching the ground. That's because they're built very differently than most of our woody trees. They are, as I said, more related to grass. So just a different idea, but certainly we can incorporate those. And there are some really great cold hardy palms that you could use in your landscape. And we do mention a few of those in the brochure as well. Yaupon holly. A lot of you might think of Yaupon holly only as that little meatball that we see in the landscape that everybody, you know, trims into those little round shapes. Well, Yaupon holly is actually a small tree. So if you get a tree form holly, it's great. You can put that in your landscape. Really tough, fairly wind resistant. Hedge maple, you may not be as familiar with. It is not a native. It is a European species. I've seen it used very successfully as a street tree here in the Raleigh area. It's fairly small, maybe 30, 35 foot in height. It's got these great kind of dark glossy green leaves, and you can see a pretty good fall color. So those are just some examples of trees that you might use that are a little bit larger. Certainly flowering dogwood and redbud are both our native plants, and remember these are trickier to put in the landscape, and I only say that because oftentimes you see people put them out in the middle of the lawn in full sun, and while we might get away with that in some circumstances, it's a really tough environment for them. And where you think about where they really grow natively, right, is on the edge of that forest. So their roots are cool, their top is kind of out in the sun. But these are both pretty wind resistant species. A couple of species I just want to mention you should avoid. Calorie pear, or often you'll just hear it called Bradford pear. The calorie pear has got terrible form, and it doesn't need a wind to break that tree apart. And it is also extremely invasive and not a native species. And so we certainly recommend not using it for all of those reasons. Yes, it does flower prolifically. They don't smell so great. And you have a great fall color. They hold the leaves a long time. They do have some pluses, but the negatives far outweigh using it in the landscape. So if you have one in your landscape, you just have to be more cautious about it, and you have to think about really pruning this tree regularly and making sure that you address the fact that all the branches kind of come out at one section on that tree, and then when it breaks apart, a whole chunk of the tree falls apart. Lace bark elm, this is also called Chinese elm. It is used a lot in street trees, plantings, as park trees because it is super tough. It will tolerate these difficult sites, but it has this upright branching habit that makes it not very wind resistant. So another idea that we want you to think about is actually planting trees in groups and then planting them in the best location in your landscape. We call it, you know, right plant, right place kind of idea. And so I'm showing you this picture from the Arbor Day Foundation. And what I want to get you to keep in mind, the biggest thing we want to think about is where we're planting trees in relationship to the utility lines. Most utility companies have regulations about how close you can be, particularly depending on what kind of utility lines we're talking about. And they have to be under 25, in some cases even under 15. And then, you know, if you plant them kind of close, they'll cut out a little L. They're going to do a U-shaped thing. So there's a lot of different pruning, which can be correct pruning, but not really what we want to see when we put a tree in a landscape. So I would recommend, actually in this case, reversing this potentially if you're concerned about storms. So what you might place these larger maturing trees out a little further from your structure. from your home, from the barn, or whatever structure is valuable to you. And put smaller maturing trees closer, because we want the benefit of trees shading certain windows at different times of the year to help reduce our energy costs, and obviously enjoy the beauty of those trees a little closer. So we might think about it in a different way, or we might use conifers or other trees. But planting trees in groups, we found, actually helps each other. They kind of actually work together. And that's kind of a cool idea when you think about it. And as I mentioned, we want to really be cautious about where we put larger maturing trees, because if they fall on the utility line, then that's a huge cleanup. And certainly in our response and recovery brochure, we're going to talk to you about making sure you don't go outside until you know it's safe. Don't touch any downed wires, because even if it appears to be a cable or telephone wire, it may actually be in contact with a utility, with an electric line, and you can still get shocked from that. And even actually to do tree work around utilities, you have to have special training, and there's a utility certification that you can get also through this ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture, which I'll talk about in just a second. But you know, why did these trees go down? Well, you can see in this case, this tree had some root rot issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that happens and how that happens. But again, trying to place trees in certain proximity. You may not always have a choice. They may put larger maturing trees out in the tree lawn, which is that area between the curb and the sidewalk. So you may not have a whole lot of say in what happens. If you can protect your trees during construction, that is really important, because compaction is one of the biggest challenges many of our urban and rural trees even actually have an issue with. And so oftentimes you think about these new developments that they're putting in, right, where they go in and they clear portions of the land, right? But they'll maybe try to leave a few trees here and there. And the problem with doing that is that they've actually seriously compacted the root system of those trees when they've done that clearing for the road and for the house and so forth. And when we do that, there are certain ways that you can actually protect the trees. You could put mulch down, very heavy layers of mulch to help minimize that. Or you just have to recognize that not every tree will be salvageable. And keep in mind, if a tree's been growing in a forest with its buddies, so to speak, then they've helped protect each other from winds, right? You see damage very differently in the forest than you do in our more open areas, because think about how trees grow in the forest. They're very narrow canopies. The branch diameter is very small in comparison to the trunk, because again, they're growing in this more competitive area. Our big trees out in the open have big trunks and big limbs. And so they're growing in a really different way, and it makes it easier for them to actually break apart. But when you talk about removing some of these trees and leaving a few behind, they've lost their buddies, and so the wind is now going to hit them in a very different way and catch those trees, and they can end up breaking apart or blowing over. And so the really challenging part of that, though, is if you've had a house that's been built in a newer development, maybe in the past 3 to 5 years, it might take that long for a tree that's still been growing in a compacted situation. It may take them that long to actually die. So it's a long-term proposition, right? And think about how much stored energy is in those really big trunks. So you can see on this tree on the left, this was a tree that went down in the microburst. Now, there were already issues there because there was a tree right next, not too far away, that didn't come down in the tree, but you can see a fairly shallow root system here. Most trees actually in this part of the world have a root system that's really no more than 3 feet deep. So anything you do on that soil level is certainly going to impact those top 6 inches of soil where the fibrous roots are and so forth. So you can see how compacted this was on the top of that soil system. And it had a big canopy, and that microburst just took that tree down. So compaction essentially, I love this picture, right? This guy he's working the soil here, and he's working that tree pretty well too. So that tree will not be there for very long. Whether they wanted to save it or not, I can't tell you that, but certainly it's not going to probably be salvageable by the time it's done, because what will happen is you'll start to see you have essentially the roots are squashed and damaged, and the roots can't move throughout the soil very easily because of that dense compacted soil. And so you'll see the tree potentially sometimes slowly decline, or maybe it dies fairly quickly. but you know, the leaves will start turning a little bit off color. You might get early fall color, you might get early leaf drop, and then you have leaves not coming back, branches dying, and then the tree eventually dies. So that's tree decline, and we see that for a lot of different reasons, you know, plants that are under stress. But the problem is again, that compaction makes those trees more prone to blow over in a storm. So providing enough space in your yard, that may not be a big deal, but in our more urban areas where we have trees planted in the street, you may have limited root space. And it doesn't mean we can't plant trees there. It just means that we have to be cautious. We have to think about what we're doing. What are the best trees to plant in those locations? Allowing those tree lawns to be as wide as possible where it's possible. Certainly those are all ways that we can put trees in those landscapes. Wanted to show you this tree on the left. You can see really how shallow that is. And part of the dilemma here is that was planted into a fairly compacted soil to start with. So one of the big important things we need to do in our landscapes is make sure when we're planting trees or any plants, even turfgrass, that we're preparing that site well, that we're adding the right amount of organic matter, that we're tilling it up, that we're mitigating compaction where possible. And of course, this tree, the fact that it was alive and doing so well is pretty amazing. As I said, trees are super resilient. The cool thing here, of course, is it was planted in an area that has porous brick pavement. So water and oxygen were able to move down through there, but you can kind of see where you've got these roots kind of circling around. So there was limited place for that tree to actually grow its roots and hold that tree up. Keep in mind, although the roots are only 3 feet deep, they are often, if there's space, they can go out 2 to 3 times the diameter of the canopy. So they can really spread out. Now they get a lot smaller, of course, the further away they get from the trunk, but they can go wherever they can grow, roots are going to grow, certainly. So we want to try to minimize cutting any of these roots. Of course, when you see something like this, it just breaks my heart. They came in to put in some utility lines possibly, but these are pretty big roots. What do you think is going to happen here? Well, this tree is likely going to fall over and fail. And so in this case, if I was an arborist in that city or in that situation, I would recommend removal of that tree because it's not going to take much wind or even much weight from rain or snow, ice to actually pull that tree down, right? We don't think so much about ice and snow, ice here, but certainly I lived in Ohio for a while. I know Andy worked up in, I believe, in New York, and he's got some great pictures of trees just, they're not great because it's sad, right? But they're breaking apart because of this ice load. And I remember a few years ago, we had a pretty severe ice storm out in the kind of the Piedmont to the western part of North Carolina, and a lot of trees were damaged. So we want to try to minimize the amount of roots that we cut. And there's a lot of kind of guidance that you can think about with how much can you cut, where can you cut, how close can you cut, and so forth. But if at all possible, we want to not cut any roots and then not compact the soil around what we've got left. So step number 4 to me is one of the most important things that you can do for your landscape unless you've had a lot of training and you feel really comfortable with arboriculture, horticulture, or whatever. Hiring a certified arborist. Now, the International Society of Arboriculture is the organization that actually certifies arborists. As I mentioned, they have a number of certifications. They have tree climber certifications, and Leslie or Andy might know all of them for sure, but they have a utility arborist, they have a master arborist, so they have different levels of training you can get. And the certified arborist is really this great, well-rounded professional. They have to have a certain number of years of experience in arboriculture and or horticulture. They have to pass a test, and they have to maintain their credits. So every year or every few years, you have to have so many credits in order to keep your certification. So you want to think about, we think about how long trees can live. I've talked about that before. And you want to think about your investment in those plants. I know it is not inexpensive to take care of trees. I have a 60-inch diameter willow oak adjacent to my house. It's very close to my house. It's actually in my neighbor's yard, but they built the fence so it looks like it's in my yard. But the survey indicates it's in their yard. But it's a beautiful tree. It's huge. But last night I had a big branch fall down, and luckily my car was not underneath it. but I do have wires there. And so I need to have somebody come in. I'm going to probably try to do some of the dead wooding myself, but I have climbed before and I am a certified arborist, so I feel comfortable doing that. But some arborists climb, or you have a company that has a certified arborist that does an appraisal for you, comes out and tells you what's going on in your landscape. Then they may have employees that do the climbing or get in the bucket truck or do that actual work for them. So that can make it expensive. They also might come in with a crane if you have to have a tree removed. And certainly once you bring in a crane, you're bringing in bigger cost. And so I know how expensive it can be, and it is very difficult to cough up that, that lots of thousands of dollars. But try not to go with the lowest cost, because you know how they say you get what you paid for. And oftentimes the folks that you bring in to do that work may, if they're not certified arborists and they don't know about the international side of arboriculture, they may not know the best practices to actually prune your trees properly. They may do it and tell you, well, this is the easiest, least expensive way, but it may not be the best way. And I'll talk to you about a couple of examples here in a second about what's not the best way. So now you've got your arborists hired, right? And the key is to hire them before the storm, because when that storm hits, you have damage. If you call them, they're going to come and help you. If not, you're calling a new company as a new customer. It might take them a long time to finally get to you. So you want to have that arborist number on hand before that storm actually hits. And so what's going to happen is that you bring them to your landscape and they'll inspect your trees. They also do other things. They also, many of them are great with soil. They understand soil. They talk about fertility and insect and disease management and so forth. So they're going to look at the overall health of your plant. Now, this tree on the right happens to be a red maple. This was on NC State's campus right on Hillsborough Street, and it is in a very tough site. Red maple, great native tree, not great for downtown hot, dry areas. And so it got a little insect called gloomy scale. But you can see the difference in this canopy from the surrounding trees. So thin canopies is what I mean by decline. Are the leaves normal for that species? Are they green, or are they off color? Are they yellow? Is the canopy dense enough for that species? Do you have old pruning wounds? Are they proper pruning cuts? A proper pruning cut is certainly going to close faster and better than an improper cut, which may not ever close over. And when I say close over, a lot of times people will use the term heal. Trees don't actually heal, but that wound wood roll that forms rolls over that wound. Now, when you get a really big wound because you've had to take a branch off because of a storm, then you have this larger wound that can introduce decay-causing organisms into the tree. That's why young tree training is so important, because we want to make cuts when the branches are small whenever possible. And so that arborist is going to inspect those trees with you and for you, right? And go outside with them, hang out with them, talk to them, ask them questions, and make sure you understand what they're going to do. This is a beautiful picture of some really nice, healthy trees, what they're supposed to look like. Not necessarily the best form here, but some really nice trees. And you can look at this tree and you can say, there's something going on here, right? Number one, it does not have a main leader, that main trunk that goes straight up from the center of the tree. That is what we call the main leader. So that's been lost. They've done so there's a big cavity up there, and you have decay probably well down into the tree. You have a large wound. You can see a little hole there as well, and probably again decay, and you can see the bark is discolored. So there's probably been some leakage of sap out of that hole. And you've got 2 branches left. I love trees. You can tell probably that I love trees, but the tree, you got to give them a little dignity and say, it's time to go. And I wouldn't park underneath this tree or anywhere near this tree. So keep in mind, we can make these decisions. We can plant another tree in its place once that one comes out. And again, working to maintain it from the time it's young. So how do you know if you got a problem? Well, that one's pretty straightforward, right? But you're looking for dead branches. And a good arborist is going to be able to recognize dead branches even in winter. So they know what to look for, right? And that's where their experience comes into play. Are there any cavities? And sometimes an arborist may have to get in the bucket, or they may have to climb your tree in order to look at the top of the tree to see what might be going on up there for some of our larger maturing trees. Are there a lot of wounds, and are there a lot of large wounds? This is a big wound. That means that limb was taken off recently, a big diameter. So are there any signs of decay? Yes, you can see in this tree there is a big cavity, and that's when you typically have some sort of decay inside the plant. It's great for wildlife, and if you had a big landscape and you could leave snags for wildlife, that's awesome and cool. But for most of our trees, we don't want cavities. And so certainly, have any trees been topped in the past? And I'll talk a little bit about topping in a minute. I would be neglectful of me not to mention it. But decay is one of the most common causes of tree failure and or branch failure. So if you have, what happens is in a lot of these trees, and some of this is caused by stress over time. Again, so you think about compaction, you think about construction, you think about potentially injury to the trunk of the tree. These are both common fungal organisms that actually do cause root rots. And so the problem is these have been likely growing inside the tree for many, many years before you actually see the conk come out. So you can look for these yourself. And if you see some funky looking thing on your tree, or even a weird abnormal growth, you know, talk to your arborist and say, hey, what the heck is going on here? You know, take some good pictures for them. This is Enonotus striatus. This is the weeping conk. And the reason they call it that is because on the surface of these conks, when they're fresh, you can kind of see a little bit of it left, are these little droplets of amber colored liquid. And that's why it kind of looks like it's weeping. These can be quite large, as you can see here. I've seen them twice this size. And these typically, when you'll see these are on the base of often willow oak trees in particular, but oaks are very susceptible to these. And so once you start seeing this, you can't knock this off and think that you've gotten rid of it, right? Because as I said, that decay has been working inside the tree for a very long time before this conk before it's a mature organism and then produces what these are essentially fruiting bodies, right? So these conks will appear, and you'll get some every year. And so if you've got a lot surrounding the entire tree, then we know we've got a serious issue. And it usually happens to about 80-year-old willow oak, and it indicates that you got a problem, right? Houston, we've got a problem. And in this case, it is unpredictable when this tree will fail. Notice what I said, when, not if. So in this case, sadly, these are trees that really may need to come down fairly quickly. So keep those in mind. Cracks, when you see cracks, that indicates to you that the tree is already failing, or the branch is already failing. You can see daylight on the other side of this crack. And although some cracks can close over, that's why you want an arborist to look at them for you, because not every crack means it's the end of the world or that tree needs to come out. But certainly if you look at this branch where you have this crack all the way through, you got problems with this branch union anyway, so this is a branch that needs to come off, or that is going to come off of that tree. It depends too on where is the crack. Is there decay associated with it? This crack is between two main leaders, right? And we don't like to see more than one main leader on a tree. And again, as I said, that's that main trunk. We want one of those. And I'll show you a picture of a young tree, and that's how we want to train them from the time they're young. We call these co-dominant stems or co-dominant leaders because they're not branches. So they don't have a branch collar, they don't form the same way, they don't have the same kind of strength. And so oftentimes they'll have bark growing in between the stems on those trees. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. So many of these branch issues, again, look at the size of this wound. Now, granted, this probably had to be taken off because it broke off in a storm or something. But you know, you can still keep the tree. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world again. It just means that you have to be watchful of that and know that when you have that drying wood, you're likely going to also have fungal organisms inside that tree. You can see that wound would roll there around the cambium where it's trying to close over, but it's just so big, and the tree is probably fairly mature. It just doesn't have the energy or the ability to close it over. So again, you're looking for cavities in those branches. You're looking for poor branch unions, very narrow angled branch unions. And in this case, what can happen is these trees are going to fall apart. This tree on the left is actually at the state troopers. I live down in Garner. This is off the Garner Road at the state troopers facility. And there was a storm that day. I went home and I quickly got my camera and came back up to see this. You can see this was a huge main stem of this beautiful chinkapin oak, and there was bark growing in between there. You can see this on the right. This was, this had two main leaders. You can see the one leader is on the ground. This tree is no longer there because that is too much of the tree to be lost in order to actually try to retain it. And we talk about that in the response and recovery brochure as well. So you can see this dark area here, that is what we call a bark inclusion or included bark. It just means that bark was growing in between the two main stems. And that is a general weakness because remember, bark is not alive on the outside, right? Bark is dead on the outside. It grows from the inside of the tree. And so as those two stems begin to grow, they put more and more pressure on each other, and then something's got to give. And it doesn't necessarily even take wind or heavy rain or ice in order for that to happen. So that's why young tree training is so important. Obviously, trunk issues. What else might be going on with the trunk, other than cracks, or is the bark coming off? Are there dead areas on the trunk? In this case, did we hit this with a lawnmower or a string trimmer? We want to be very cautious of that because some trees are super sensitive to that, and that wound will never go away. And that can certainly weaken that tree. And this tree also actually looks like you can't see any root flare here. It looks like it goes straight down into the ground. So that says to me that it wasn't planted quite correctly. And so, putting the tree in the right place, picking the right plant, and planting it correctly are all three really important steps when you're putting plants in your landscape. So here's just another example of what might be happening in a tree that you can't necessarily see, but an arborist can look for signs of that, and there are some cool tools out there that they can use to actually determine if there's hollow or cavity in the middle of the tree. Now, again, just because you have a cavity in the middle of the tree doesn't mean that you have to get rid of the tree. It depends on how much good sound wood you have around the outside. As you can see, this is not sound wood. And there were lots of other issues. The trunk of this tree, the root flare of this tree was actually completely rotted. So, and that was one that came down in the microburst as well. So, many of you have probably heard of topping. This is actually a picture I took in Italy. They do topping all the time there, and their trees live a long time, but we certainly don't think this is okay. And these trees are not sprouting back very well. So eventually it catches up with you. So topping is essentially removing a tree, an end of a branch or an end of a stem of large trees. Of course, they do it to crape myrtle. I'll mention that in a second. But cutting them back to kind of an arbitrary place. There's no lateral branch or lateral buds to take over the growth of what you're taking off. And so usually we're doing it because we're afraid that the tree has gotten too big. Well, that means maybe we should have planted a different tree there, or we can reduce the height of a tree, but we have to do that properly. And certainly that's where a skilled arborist can come in and reduce the canopy of a tree if you want. But what happens is you get this sprouting, right? And that can lead to this decay interior, right? So this tree was topped right there. You see it can't close over because it's not at a place where there is that ability in the tree. And so you got these stems kind of coming out, and they grow really fast, right? And you can see that here. And this is, by the way, not the same as something we call pollarding, which is very different, but technique, and it doesn't promote issues. They do it a lot in Europe. We don't seem to like it so much here, and that's fine. But so you can see that you have these really big branches, and they can be 20, 30 feet long in a very short period of time. They grow very quickly, and they're not attached to much, right? They're attached to that decay, and so they can break off, and this is what you end up in kind of a small reference. You can see these branches are dead because this tree had been topped and they were broken. Again, it can happen in a storm or not. I swiped this picture from the North Carolina Urban Forestry Council's website. You should go check out this article, and you can use this to tell everybody and teach everybody that you see to stop topping crape myrtle, right? You can see how different those trees are performing. This is a tree that's been topped year after year after year. The canopy is thin, it hasn't grown very well, and you have some flowers, and sometimes the flowers are really big. but that doesn't mean they're really good, right? And the tree isn't overall healthy. And when you look at this one on the right, to me, this picture says 1,000 words, right? Another thing that I see some folks do that don't know any better is a practice called lion tailing or lion's tail. And this is from the ISA, the Texas ISA. And this is just a really cool picture where this was the tree originally. Why they decided they needed to limit up, maybe they wanted to be able to see the discount cleaner sign. There's ways to do that without doing this on the right. And so you can see they put this picture of a lion's tail in there, which is so great, right? Because it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So in this case, all the wind is going to be caught up here in the branches, right? And down and pulled down through here. And there's all kinds of physics involved. I'm not very good at physics, but all that pressure is going to be put on at that end of that branch attachment. It worries me that this guy did this with a ladder too. That's just scary. And so the wind is going to whip this around like a lion's tail, and eventually it'll break off down there. So we don't want to see those practices done commonly. So as we mentioned, and we've kind of probably beating it into your head, start when trees are young, prune them properly, select good trees at the nursery. So here is the great example. Here's a main leader going straight up through the top of this tree. This is important for shade trees. Obviously, smaller flowering trees, multi-stem trees are a different ballpark, right? That kind of different situation all around. So you know which stem is in charge here, right? This main leader is in charge of everything else. And so you can see it controls this with hormones, actually, not only in the short term, but over the long term. It determines how fast these other branches are growing in some way. Sometimes an arborist may have to come in if there's something else competing with this, they may have to trim that back. But I want to show you also the importance of these great U-shaped angles of the branches. That's what we're looking for, and we're looking for them to be equally spaced all the way around. Now this is a young tree, so most of these limbs probably won't be there by the time it gets older, because they'll probably do a little bit more clearance of that tree. This is a pecan behind Kilgore Hall. It's got great pruning. You can see these great branches, and we are trying to build what we call a scaffold. You think about a scaffold and how they're built to be strong. That's the same kind of theory we're looking at with young trees. So if you don't know, I have a video on the NC State Port Department's website that shows you how to do young tree training. There's a couple of little segments to it, so it's not like going to take you 20 minutes to watch it. Just a lot of great little snippets. So that may be something to check out to learn more about how to actually do the cutting. Where do you make the cuts and how do you do it? Thinking about that root lower area of the trunk, again, we want to make sure the arborists will look for these. If there are trunk girdling roots, we want to consider removing those, because if they get too big, it's too late. And this one here might be a little too late. And what will happen is it obviously cuts off movement of water and nutrients up and down through the tree, but they can actually cause that tree to fall over, especially if you've got heavy winds or heavy ice or rain load. This is something, again, looking for what's happening down at the base of those trees. So you want to look from the top to the bottom, right? Obviously, you can't necessarily see the top of all your trees, but you can look to see if the leaves seem the right color, the right shape, and so forth. Now, keep in mind, if you've had a drought for a year or two, the following season, your tree may have smaller leaves on average than before. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a huge concern, but if you're looking at your trees all the time, then you're going to notice those kinds of things. So this, again, this is a tree that was lost right north of campus. It was, I think this was, I don't know if it was on Brooks. It might have been on Brooks. It was really sad. And somebody came out and they looked at the trunk of the tree and they put little tags on it telling you how old the tree was throughout time. It was a pretty old tree, but it was in a very difficult site, as you can see all the concrete surrounding it. So it was in a very small space, like you can kind of see up here in this tree lawn, but it was even smaller. It did not have a tree lawn. But you can see it did go down in a serious storm, but it would have probably failed no matter what, because you can see the extent of decay underneath. So there was a lot of dead wood and instability in the underside of this tree. So it really essentially broke off right where those, you can see where the roots were coming down toward the curb. And a lot of times roots will grow right over the curb, and that's what happened here, but it broke off right there. And then it was uprighted because they cut the wood off, so the top of the tree off. So I want to just remind you that if we do this all well and thoughtfully, don't be afraid to plant trees, right? A lot of times I know that after storms, people will come to knock on your door and say, hey, we'll remove these trees for you for this really great price, so you don't have to be afraid anymore. And a lot of people take advantage of it. It's often not a really great price in the first place, and it's usually people that don't really care about trees. They're out to make money. A good arborist, a good arboriculture company does not need to come knocking on your door. They have plenty of business, and they love trees. Arborists love trees. They want to do everything they can to keep them growing and keep them doing well. So they want your trees to live for as long as possible. So they're going to do everything in their power to take good care of them and make sure that they're healthy and as safe as possible. Nothing is without risk, right? But if we're thoughtful in what we plant and where we plant it, we can be really quite successful in growing trees. Like, holy cow, right? Maybe not every tree is going to get like that, but certainly we can get some really amazing trees. And as I said, if we do things right, trees are pretty resilient on their own. So just kind of a wrap up of all these readiness tips: hire a certified arborist. Make sure you got somebody that knows what they're doing. They come out yearly and look at your trees, or every other year. It doesn't have to be yearly, but every year is a really good policy. And usually they're going to give you a pretty good deal on a long-term maintenance program for your plants. Remove dead branches and address any repairable issues, like if you have a codominant leader, take one of those out when the tree is young. So that's where that training comes into play. Don't top or lion tail trees. No matter what anybody tells you, it doesn't make your tree safer. It actually makes your tree less safe. Don't hit your tree with the lawnmower. Try to keep people from driving into your trees. But yeah, try to keep your, if you got a tree in your landscape, try to have, and you've got lawn, try to have some mulch around your tree rather than turf grass right up to the trunk, because turf and trees don't necessarily get along all that well. Nobody wins really in that situation. So having some good mulch or landscape beds around your trees is much better than turf. Remove overly mature trees. So again, you get these trees that are super old and they begin to decline. As I said, I have this 60 plus inch diameter tree that's starting to drop a lot of dead limbs. It was never trimmed when it was younger, so there are some serious issues. And I do worry about that if there were a serious storm to come through, because it would fall, either the branches are going to fall on my house or the neighbor's house for sure, or both. Remove any dead or hazardous trees before the wind does come. So you've got that arborist looking at things. There, as I said, they're going to try to help you manage what they can, and they'll be honest with you about what can't be salvaged and what really poses serious risk or hazard to you and your landscape. And so they will recommend removal in those cases. But always keep in mind, you can always get a second opinion. You don't have to rely on one person. And if somebody comes in and just automatically says, I got to take this tree down, be wary of that, because that may not necessarily always be necessary. Again, removing trunk girdling roots and so forth when they're small. So these are really just common sense things, and things that you can look for and you can think about, and certainly talk with your arborist about. So if you need any more information or want to talk to any of us about it, I've provided, I didn't ask them if it was okay, but I've provided Andy and Leslie's email addresses so that you can contact them if you have any questions about anything we've covered tonight or anything else related to urban trees, suburban trees. They're the folks, and of course the Forest Service can talk to you about rural trees. If you have some wooded property that you need some advice on, there's certainly folks out there that can help you with that as well. And so obviously I work for NC State Extension, and I do have a website there, and you can link to a number of different websites, videos that I have there on pruning and planting and so forth. And we do have a great plant toolbox, which you can go to for the Department of Horticultural Science to look up different species that you could plant here in North Carolina, and just a lot of great information. So thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope that you got a little bit out of this and learned a little bit something new, and you're excited about trees in a good way and not afraid. If we get well prepared, we should be well set for any storm that comes. So thanks. Leslie, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Barb. Hopefully you guys got some good information that you can take back to your own property. Keep an eye out on those trees. We do have time for, if you do have a question, please do feel free to type it in that question panel box, or you can email any one of us directly and we'll follow up with you. We did have 2 questions that came in. One was providing a link to that young tree training video that you referenced, Barb, earlier in your presentation. I don't know if you have it.
I don't have it off the top of my head, but here's the easiest way to get to it. If you actually go to the NC State Horticultural Department website, it'll tell you, it'll have a little button that says faculty. Click on my name, it'll take you to my webpage, and the links for, again, the tree planting and young tree training video is there. So it's, it's a fun video. I hope you'll find it fun. It was not, it's not lights, camera, action kind of video. It's a great down-to-earth segment on young tree training. So
and when you say young, Barb, when you say young, how young is young?
That's a great question. Yeah, Leslie, that's an awesome question. So as soon as you plant a tree in your landscape, so if you buy a tree that happens to have 2 codominant leaders, remove one of those leaders right then, as soon as you plant it. Don't take a whole lot off, because obviously we need those branches to produce food to help produce new roots as the tree is establishing. But you can begin, if it's a perfect tree like the one I showed you, and let me just skip back to that. So when you look at the tree like this, you would probably suspect that this tree is probably about 8 to 10 years old. It depends on, and that might even be too much, but it depends on how long they kept it in the nursery. So they're not trying to do this very long, right? They want to grow them to a good size and then plant them in the landscape. So, I certainly like to see 2, 2.5, maybe 3.5 inch caliper trees go in a landscape. I'm hesitant to recommend much bigger trees, but a lot of people do. And so again, making sure if you got a perfect tree, you probably don't need to do much of anything on it until it's been established for a couple of years. But every year, just watch for crossing branches, watch for those narrow branch angles that you might have to remove. So a young tree, we're talking, depending on the species, right? We're talking anywhere from 10 to even 20 or so years old. When we hit the 20s, we're kind of getting into that middle age, overly mature trees. You think about an oak that can live 80 years. Obviously, middle age is about 50 or so. So you can still do good pruning when they're middle-aged, but again, you're trying to make the smallest cut possible, so doing that when they're younger is really important. And the cool thing is if you're fixing problems when they're younger, it minimizes the amount of pruning you have to do as they can become middle-aged and older, right? And that saves money, because you don't need somebody to come and climb or get in a bucket truck to fix your trees later. So you save a lot of money by doing it when the tree is young and the branches are small.
All right, great. We did have some more questions that came in, but we are out of time. So I'm going to take record of those questions and respond back to you, if not this evening, then tomorrow morning, just so we can get those questions asked. And I'll make sure that they get addressed. But do also feel free to reach out to Dr. Barb, myself, or Andy Plinger if you do have questions about trees on your property and how to better prepare your landscape for storm season, for hurricane season, or winter storm season if you're in the mountains. Hopefully you'll join us in 2 weeks for our next part 2 in our Trees and Storms webinar series. And I appreciate everybody taking their time out of their evening tonight to join us. Hopefully you're able to glean some good information that will help you manage those trees. And do please remember to take that short little exit survey as we close out the webinar this evening. And hopefully we'll be able to build on this program and offer more opportunities to learn about the trees on your landscape. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Dr. Fair, for joining us and presenting all this useful information. And thank you, Andy, for partnering with us on this and helping us get this information out there. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Good night, all.